Good afternoon, everybody, and it's lovely to see you all. For those who don't know me, I'm Paul O'Craig, the Vice-Chancellor of the University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural lecture by Professor Wilson Ng. And I have to say, I think this, of all of our inaugural lectures, this is I suspect, the most dramatic and intriguing and compelling title we've had, when water is thicker than blood. Treachery, corruption and prosperity among ethnic Chinese enterprises in post-colonial Malaysia and Singapore. I'm really looking forward to that, but before then it's my job to tell you a little bit about Wilson. He was born in Penang in Malaysia and educated here in the UK. He studied mathematics at Trinity College in Cambridge. He got a first, of course, and then he did the sensible thing, which was to set off on the path of becoming an investment banker. And you'll notice that Wilson's not wearing a tie. He told me, that's how you know you're an investment banker. Other bankers wear ties, but investment bankers don't wear ties. So I'm learning something all the time here. Wilson joined Rothschild as a graduate trainee, then had 10 years in corporate finance. He was seconded to Singapore. There he became head of the corporate finance department. He went on to become group finance director of L&M, a blue-chip group of engineering companies in Singapore, and other senior posts that Wilson has held has included being deputy chairman of Guthrie, Singapore's oldest publicly quoted civil engineering, leisure management and property group. You sometimes hear it said that academics have no experience of what some people call the real world. But I really think nobody could say that of Wilson. He has over 20 years experience as a senior manager in investment banking and corporate finance. He's worked in London, Guernsey, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Brunei and Pakistan. He's had a particular interest in technology ventures looking to commercialise their products and services. With all that remarkable experience behind him, Wilson then returned to study, gaining his MBA from Royal Holloway, then going back to Cambridge to do his PhD at the Judge Business School. And there he used his direct knowledge and experience of the corporate finance world to apply to his researches in the corporate governance of family-controlled businesses in Chinese East Asia. And following the PhD, Wilson began a second major career as an academic and quickly established a reputation for outstanding teaching and outstanding research. He became a lecturer in entrepreneurship at the University of Leeds before joining the University of Westminster as a reader. Then in 2012, I'm pleased to say he joined us here at Roehampton as a reader in innovation and entrepreneurship. And just 2 years later, in 2014, we were delighted to promote him to a personal chair. Wilson's an extremely dedicated teacher and doctoral student supervisor. He's also established an international reputation for the quality of his research. His areas of interest include comparative studies of management processes in small and medium enterprises, family-owned businesses and startups. He has a particular interest in the interactions of entrepreneurship, creativity and finance in the biotech sector. And I understand that the principal context of this work and the beneficiaries of this research are policymakers and practitioners in the biotech industry, specifically investors, customers and environmental groups. I think it's rare that somebody achieves such outstanding success in two quite distinct careers in the way that Wilson has done. And it's also rare for a researcher to have such in-depth knowledge and direct experience of the subject which he or she chooses to study. I'm sure that Wilson was a great loss to the world of investment banking and corporate finance. But their loss has been the Academy's gain, and I'm delighted that in particular that it's been the University of Roehampton's gain. So please welcome Professor Wilson Ng.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, for that extremely generous introduction. Let me just try and get rid of this particular start so that we can begin on the right footing. Thank you very much for attending my inaugural lecture. I'd like to speak in rather personal terms about my interest in entrepreneurial businesses in Chinese Southeast Asia, and in particular about certain large and long-lived firms that are now led mainly by sons of ethnic Chinese founders. These types of firms are called multi-generational in the family business literature, and for many years, multi-generational firms that are owned and controlled by ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs have managed significant assets in and beyond Southeast Asia. Although founders of these firms typically had just secondary schooling, they sent their children at a precocious age to boarding schools in England. Now, this practice of sending sons and daughters away began in the 1960s, after Chinese entrepreneurs in Malaysia and Singapore had gotten wealthy from exploiting post-war opportunities. The problem behind this practice was the widening economic and social gap that appeared between urban Chinese and rural Malays, who formed most of Malaysia's population. This brewing national problem made for an unstable political climate in pre-independence Malaya and continued after independence in 1957. Public security got worse in the 1960s. There was a resurgence of communist attacks in 1968, and the SAS were called to support local commandos, who went by the unlikely name of VAT 69, not a Scotch whiskey. SAS and VAT 69 did a superb double act and brutally suppressed the insurgency without addressing the problems that caused it. So, security continued to be an issue, and my family decided to spirit their children to a safe environment in England. England seemed obvious, as Britons had been running the country, and wealthy Chinese, including my grandfather, behaved and tried to look English. They observed the amazing benefits of an education that got locals to collect taxes so efficiently, and thought how fantastic it would be if they could run their businesses half as efficiently. A national state of emergency was called in 1969 as racial riots erupted. My parents, as nouveau riche Chinese, were particularly fearful their precious sons would be targets for kidnap by Malay sans-culottes. Such fears tend to be self-fulfilling. And after a couple of actual kidnaps, it turned out by Chinese gangsters and not by Malays, many wealthy Chinese in Malaysia and Singapore sent their children to boarding school. They really thought their children would gain a fantastic education, and when order returned, they would come home and carry on as if they'd never left. Post-education, a few sons and daughters did return, and sooner or later, they began working in their family enterprises. In 1970, I was one of those sons who was dispatched to an English boarding school at a ridiculously young age. Sons of Chinese families ended up running their businesses, many of which are now household names in Southeast Asia. Yet given this wealth and the dispersion in control among cousins and in-laws, this seemed a strong rationale for at least selling down the family shareholding to create a dispersed investor base for growth. Wasn't going public about founders cashing out of their ventures and leaving professionals to develop it? With cash from selling out, sons and daughters could start another enterprise with family jewels intact. This, anyway, was a conventional, rational business case for selling out and starting up. Indeed, many multi-generational firms have sold down their co-ownership as they went public. However, many other multi-generational firms have gone the opposite direction and consolidated their core ownership through complex share arrangements. A typical arrangement is where corporate control of a publicly quoted entity remains in the hands of the founding family through a holding company. The problem here is that control is wielded by shareholders who only partially own the firm, while minority shareholders have no real engagement in the firm they also own. This problem was exposed in 1998 during the East Asian financial crisis, when ethnic Chinese firms were thought to have played a major role in causing and then deepening the crisis. Yet, if those firms had wealthy owners with more to lose from setting up opaque structures and selling their shares, an obvious question was why most of them have been able to survive and thrive? This question seems just as relevant now, 20 years after the financial crisis, when multi-generational sons of founders have persisted with the same closely controlled firms handed down to them. What seems to have happened is that a number of these firms have developed a hybrid character in which they have continued to do the same things, but have invested abroad, often in different activities where sons of founders have then played an active role. Several prominent multi-generational firms have therefore expanded, notably far from home, including the UK. The finance literature has presented a rational perspective for the expansion of East Asian firms in Western markets in terms of spreading investment risk away from volatile markets in third world economies. Yet the availability of less volatile markets close to home and familiarity of many multi-generation sons with markets in the UK and America questions the extent to which the choice of investment destination is just about finance. To what extent might there be a non-financial explanation for distant investments of today's ethnic Chinese firms? First, a few facts of investments by ethnic Chinese in Britain. I prefer to speak of multi-generational firms as opposed to family businesses. The main reason, which I will discuss, is that these firms are owned and controlled by a closed network of business associates who speak the same Chinese dialect and whose relatives originated from the same region in China. Those associates include blood relatives, but unlike family firms, the business is not about the nuclear family of parents who set up a venture and their immediate offspring who then run the venture. In Britain, firms controlled by ethnic Chinese from Singapore and Malaysia manage substantial assets in a wide range of industries, including public utilities, hospitality, gaming, and entertainment, consumer goods manufacturers and retailers, and industrial engineering, in addition to numerous high-profile properties, for example, Battersea Power Station. You can see most of the investments here I've stated are under a particular dialect group, which I will discuss from a particular part of coastal China further up the China coast. Hong Kong Chinese also own and control many other British assets, including high-tech firms. But my focus here is on hard, labor-intensive businesses that ethnic Chinese have invested in and managed in Britain. These investments are typically long-lived. For example, Kuala Lumpur Kepong, which has been run for many years by the oldest son of the founder, bought the toiletries brand Crabtree and Evelyn in 1996. While Millennium and Copthorne Hotels, which is run by the scion of a Singapore Chinese family, is based in London and listed on the London Stock Exchange also since 1996. I observed that many of these investments had been made by ethnic Chinese firms controlled by westernized sons. In support of this view, contrast this side with my next slide. This slide sets out a number of projects that ethnic Chinese have invested in by nationality: Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, and China, and suggests the engagement of ethnic Chinese from outside China relative to investors in China. Look at Taiwan and the number of investments. Of course, this is just the number of investments, not the value of them. The value of these investments, some of these investments, to give you an idea, let me suggest in the next slide, produced by the Singapore government of Department of Statistics. Singapore has a lot of slides, a lot of statistics about its own population. This is a very recent slide, which comes out of, set of slides which comes out of 1996. You've seen the total FDI out of Singapore, by Singapore corporates. 41.6 billion Singapore dollars, roughly 2 to 1. Yeah? So we're looking at 20 billion value, not new investments, but cumulative in 2014. I continue to find popular financial answers to these investments deeply dissatisfying because they do not explain why those sons of founders should have kept their old firms, and indeed why they've expanded specifically in Britain. we think that the UK offers an obvious investment destination for common law countries that share our legal system, then the same argument could be applied for those sons to invest exclusively in other common law jurisdictions nearer to home. Why invest significant capital in Britain and in such tough businesses? For those sons of founders, I wondered the extent to which their Anglicization might have influenced their decision to keep returning to familiar destinations. I wondered if there was a deeper personal interest in doing so, perhaps an interest that was about what an organization's writer called the emotional workplace within, and how this interest might be connected with the persistence of their multi-generational firms. Several of those leaders, and now my research subjects, were school friends, and I gained access through them. What possibly could I learn from a few schoolmates? Alvison and Dietz, in their 2000 book on doing critical management research, suggest that the researcher plays a central part in a political project in which sense and meaning of management is co-constructed with managers and other research subjects. By challenging that which is established, Alvison and Dietz suggest that researchers can contribute to emancipating hidden and unexpressed ideas and identities that may be repressed by personal experiences. To me, it follows from this perspective, which I accept, that the positioning of the management researcher in her own research and the process of producing interesting insights are motivated by the researcher's evolving process of learning about a phenomenon of interest. So, in this process, I've also unearthed a few unexpected questions about the nature and purpose of education, which I share with you, my audience. These questions might intrigue those of you who have a sense of the search that I and some of my research subjects began to face following our education in England. Namely, a search for self-identity, and for that identity to be accepted by someone, somewhere. My questions might be troubling if we consider that they may still be faced by kids from Asia and elsewhere who continue to be educated in English boarding schools. Some of the lifelong effects of this education are evident in 3 stories that I will now relate to you from my research. While this research concerned the persistence of multi-generational firms, it turned out that part of this explanation was about the workplace within its multi-generational leaders. My first story is about my own experience as a son of the founder of a Malaysian Chinese firm and how I came to use experience in my research. In fact, I was a middle son of the 4th generation of a minority dialect group from southern China who emigrated to Malaya in the 1870s. That part of China was the antithesis of God's country, with nothing to farm and lots of British opium from nearby Hong Kong to numb survivors from the reality of hopelessness. But perhaps the only advantage of Guangdong was its location by the South China Sea. Beyond this watery escape route, past the well-trained gaze of colonial police policing the port of Hong Kong, lay another teeming British port, Singapore. A short further distance up the other side of Malaya lay another crown colony, Penang, which was much less teeming than Singapore. In the 19th century, Penang was a destination of choice for Chinese boat people who spoke a different dialect from the wealthier clans from up the China coast. My boat people included my great-grandfather, who arrived in Penang and was welcomed by members of his cultural clan of Sining Cantonese, who had settled in Penang 100 years before. That clan was my relative's family, and they found work for him in a tin mine. Over time, a number of enterprising clan members began exploiting internal resources of labor and networks among their clan membership by launching enterprises as smiths, traders, and shopkeepers. Organization scholars have suggested how each clan contained people from similar backgrounds, speaking the same dialect, who were workers, customers, and suppliers in an interactive, self-contained community. Building on this knowledge of clans, I substituted what I called an extended community of ethnic Chinese firms for the Western perspective of family, as businesses were organized by community members who were appointed to corporate roles not by blood ties, but by their relationships within and value to their community. A chief implication of my community view was that Chinese businesses could survive and thrive by positioning themselves within their community and serving its members while being supplied from communal resources of human and material capital. My great-grandfather was one of his clan who escaped the vortex of back-breaking labor and pot smoking by exploiting this vortex. Instead of smoking pot, he opened a pawn shop to fund those who smoked pot. With cash from his pawn shop, he expanded in another cash business as a middleman, buying and selling latex rubber in British plantations. The problem, there was also the opportunity for my relatives expanding enterprise, was that the rubber industry was well regulated. Control was exercised by means of a sales tax, an export duty, and license for middlemen. As control was maintained by managing these middlemen, colonial administrators welcomed them. Entrepreneurs were typically Chinese immigrants, but ambitious immigrants faced a life-changing barrier. This was that in trading up to the status of middlemen, they needed to speak good English. So my great-grandfather received the modern equivalent of executive education in Victorian English culture. Soon there grew an English school system for expatriates and wannabe entrepreneurs who were taught British history, English and Latin by Anglican schoolmasters for careers based on English and Latin in the teeming jungles of Malaya. So what's the problem here? After all, French colonials also set up French schools in Vietnam, Dutch colonials, Dutch curriculum schools in Indonesia. The problem with all colonial education was pretty similar. Schools were set up on the occupying power's terms to educate an elite of expatriates and supporting locals with a foreign curriculum that distinguished and separated them from locals. As the British Empire endured in Malaya for nearly 200 years, it wasn't surprising that in English schools, pupils learned not just English, but also a particular politicized approach to education based on selective knowledge. Geography was therefore about Britain and continental Europe. History lessons about England versus Europe. And science focused on the discoveries of Great Britons. Fast forward 100 years and do we in this room recognize this curriculum? Why? It's the same curriculum that many of us also endured in our education here. So for my forefathers, thousands of miles away, they bought into that sense of the world in order to survive and thrive. For this great endeavor, my grandfather was rewarded with a CBE and OBE for services to business. What a rare image there of both George VI and Princess Elizabeth. Having been so rewarded, it followed that my siblings and I had to also develop our English identity. But what was my identity to be? One of the principal symbols of identity is, of course, one's name. Some of you know that my given name is not Wilson. At prep school, my housemaster, who was also my Latin teacher, suggested that I should have an English name. As my Chinese name is Wei Sun, between my Latin teacher and my parents, Wilson seemed obvious. An alternative suggestion of Winston was quickly discarded as inappropriate when a Great Briton of this name had recently departed. A second symbol of identity construction was a gendered sense of growing up in a male-only boarding school. I was far from anywhere, and the plattest piece of earth that was forever raining. Professor McNarland will know which piece of earth I'm talking about. I recall wandering out every morning to the trunk road from London to imagine some sort of link with a distant world beyond. It was only decades later, when speaking with my schoolmates, that I realized how the same crushing loneliness was also experienced by little boys from the UK as well as Asia. As a researcher of organizations, I reflected that perhaps the process of learning to manage certain organizations might also involve a sense of crushing loneliness, so that learning was then about how future leaders might numb their emotions and remain objectively focused on their objects. However, my numb journey through life was interrupted when my father, who ran our multi-generation business, died in 1985. Ordinarily, my older brother would have been summoned to lead the business. But that brother had his own way of searching for his identity. Eschewing the good English life, he decided to become a field reporter in Central America, worked as a BBC stringer in Guatemala, and got killed. Suddenly, I was called to the helm of my multi-generational business, which had extended from pawn shops to the ownership of rubber plantations. At the time, I was working for an English bank, and I returned home in my assumed identity as an English banker, wearing these shoes you see here. In Penang, I was thrust into a meeting with thousands of barefoot employees who spoke little English. 3 generations of middlemen had been able to control local employees whose exploitation was the basis of our business. But the shoes clearly didn't fit. No one understood what I was saying, and I started to get much hotter than the weather. The outcome was obvious. I had to sell the 4-generation business, which was an outcome that reaffirmed the self-fulfilling cliche that family businesses last but 3 generations. My second story is about a family friend of my generation who was also sent to boarding school and then attended university here. The multi-generation business of this friend flourished in Singapore under his stewardship, and I sought to learn why his enterprise persisted and indeed expanded while remaining closely controlled. For a start, this friend returned home and sought to carve out his own space as our local Singaporean. So he launched local ventures, selling computers to high-end watches while making a name, playing jazz and crooning to local pop songs. Yet when the jazz player was called to run his multi-generational business, he ditched these interests and focused on that business. You might have assumed that the business he gave up his life for was gold dust, but for all its longevity, that business reflected what is known about too many family businesses: sleepy, uncreative, and worst of all for investors, he had become stuck in the dull, stagnant industry of Chinese medicine. So this firstborn son of a 110-year-old hand-me-down hung up his suit and went back in time to the cement floors of his Chinese shophouse with its whirring ceiling fans and musty atmosphere where coolies once sought to fix their opium addiction. Why on earth did he get into this business? This is before renovation. Whirling fan on top, original. Renovated, no whirling fan, cement floors. I reflected on a few remarks that the jazz player repeated to me. I really hate authority, he said. I'm rebellious by nature. This was obvious from young, and I'm still very uncomfortable with authority and rules. I wondered if the jazz player was trying to tell me something, perhaps about himself and what he was really interested in, that threw light on his rebellious nature. This sense of what he was trying to say, beyond perhaps what he might himself be able to make sense of, was part of what I sought to learn as I sensed that the jazz player's emotional workplace behind his rebelliousness could be a way of comprehending the persistence of this old business. At one level, the jazz player's actions were testament to his success in turning around a dull enterprise. That success was no mean feat for a business that only sold potions of herbs and roots. When the jazz player was elected to chair the firm, he presented his motivation in terms of realizing the unfulfilled legacy of his grandfather, a really visionary man. But I sensed there was another reason, a reason that I saw in the things he said and did, often repetitively. One of his favorite actions was to show me the fingerprinting research he was undertaking of Chinese medicines that ensured its consistency. I wondered if this passion for fingerprinting was not about his search for an identity for his business in a modern world that insisted on scientific evidence and fingerprinting labeling. Perhaps the jazz player also saw his own multiple identities being bound up with his search. In this sense, realizing the unfulfilled legacy of his grandfather was an allegorical turn of phrase that reminded the jazz player to connect with his own deepest beliefs. I learned that he did so by connecting with its extended community in the firm. A principal technique was in forming personal alliances with local managers who were long-standing trusted employees. those Cantonese-speaking managers would continue to run the business while he focused on its fingerprinting and strategic development. The jazz players' partnerships among his own selected networks therefore formed the basis for developing a modern business that remained closely controlled. Out of these partnerships, a self-sustaining community of resource suppliers and consumers took shape. This community, on the right-hand side, featured managers who were dedicated to managing communal resources that they were familiar with, and Chinese customers, many of whom had bought the same potions for generations. Upon its public listing in 2000, the community of the listed firm became enlarged with more of the same shareholders, more Chinese customers in more locations, as well as additional resource suppliers in new locations. But here, the smooth narrative faced an abrupt challenge. The jazz player's actions in transforming an old firm made some of his relatives jealous. Those relatives held a big stake in the firm, and they were out for money and revenge. Acting in concert with a predatory investor, a hostile takeover bid was launched. Early one morning, the jazz player received a phone call. It was from a merchant bank who asked what I was going to do. It was 8:30 a.m., and I was in shock. Although the jazz player was in shock, he got over it. Where I remained in shock and surrendered my family jewels, the jazz player turned this unexpected event to his advantage and cut a deal with the predators. He rallied his managers and negotiated to buy the medicine business out of the old firm, which saved the business from being broken up. Post-acquisition, the jazz player turned to develop a new business, which he called integrated healthcare. His cozy alliance of stakeholders, which involved well-organized roles enacted by the firm's managers, relatives, and customers, was illustrated in this new activity, which has become the firm's future. This future was about introducing therapies that drew on a combination of clinically proven medicines and Chinese herbs. Unusually, the vision drew on the jazz player's personal familiarity with Western markets, while it retained the Chinese stakeholder base of the business. However, in pursuing this new future, there were a number of trade-offs. A major trade-off was that he couldn't really extend his traditional firm's networks by integrating it with a new non-Chinese audience. This integration seemed to be a goal of the jazz player in marrying his biological family's interests with his own rebellious nature. I wondered whether the firm might continue to survive but not thrive by keeping it as a dull purveyor of medicinal potions. But I also realized that addressing this question would mean ignoring the idiosyncratic nature of a rebellious public schoolboy who played out that part of his nature in shaping a type of multi-generation firm in which he has achieved a level of self-fulfillment. And what was this rebellious boy trying to say? Perhaps a sense that he had come to accept that he was not accepted by his relatives, and that he had found an answer to why he really hated authority, because his own parents had sent him away to an alien environment where he survived by being rebellious. Hence, the jazz player's adventures were also his means of reconciling contrasting halves of his foreign and local nature. My third story is about an ethnic Chinese head of a multi-generational firm in Hong Kong that was engaged in building and construction. This firm faced similar issues of corporate development and the role of related and non-related shareholders. But there were key differences, including the skills of the firm's chairman, who had been Chinese educated. I was intrigued to learn how this multi-generational firm had persisted in a highly competitive industry under leaders who were very different to the jazz player. The construction firm was second generation, and its current head had been handpicked by the two founders, who were brothers, to succeed them. But another key difference was that the handpicked chair was not a blood relative. Instead, he had been a lowly laborer when he first joined the brothers' firm, and one of the brothers had then adopted him. This adoption seemed to be a turn of phrase and wasn't legally binding, but the turn of phrase enabled the chair to explain his own nomination to head the firm over the natural offspring of both brothers. The official reason for this decision was the chair's outstanding performance. But over time, I learned that the founder's decision did raise enormous dissension among blood relatives, but dissension was suspended, if not silenced, by the founder brothers' powerful voice. The scenario of an elevation of a non-relative to the highest role in the firm that is legally controlled by relatives has puzzled a lot of audiences. Yet the preference of an adopted son over natural offspring makes sense in an extended perspective of close control, where key decisions are made by powerful elders of the firm who act as trustees for all stakeholders. It followed in this perspective that blood relations were no barrier to the prior importance of the firm's well-being. It also followed that when I got to know the non-family chairman in 2002, he had been in post 10 years and seemed to have used his time very effectively to cement his own position. An important pillar of this position was that family shareholders had moved to a largely passive role in the firm. The chair played a big role in this move. When he was appointed, 3 executive directors, including the chair, managed the firm, and only one of these directors was related to the 2 founders. The chair said that the founders accepted the structure because of his close relationship with them for over 100 years. I was incredulous. Was he really 100 years old? It turned out that the chair's family had originated from the same region in China and spoke the same non-Cantonese dialect, which was unusual in Cantonese-speaking Hong Kong. The chair's story was that as a young employee, he caught the eye of the 2 brothers by making astute, cost-saving suggestions. The young man was tested many times. His tests got harder, and as he passed each test, the brothers took him closer under their trust. The future chair began to be groomed for important tasks, including contract negotiations. 2 other directors then related how the chair was put in charge of negotiations for a major housing contract. At this point, an unusual quirk in their story appeared. Unknown to the chair, another relative had been given the task by the 2 founders of negotiating the same contract using an unrelated firm. Although the future chair had not been told of this bid, he said that he had expected to be tested. The 2 prospective successors, therefore, went head-to-head in a gladiatorial contest where one side, the blood relatives, had been given the advantage of prior information. The family bidder leaked rumors to undermine the future chair. The chair countered by planting spies in the relatives' camp. This is normal, cutthroat contracting. But unlike the movie of this name, the officially supported gladiator, the incoming chair, won the contest and contract. Soon afterwards, the former laborer was promoted to the position of general manager. Yet the GM's only experience was in Hong Kong, with Hong Kong Chinese in the building trade. I was intrigued in how the chair of a firm that subsequently gained a public listing was able to develop it with such limited experience. I wondered whether his apparent limitations had in fact helped the firm's success. At one level, this success was achieved by the firm winning lots of major contracts. But from the cutthroat nature of the construction business, it seemed a fair bet that there were many other stories behind this success, and the chair also played a starring role in those stories. A revealing story of the chair's success was related by the firm's finance director, a newly joined employee who was keen to uphold corporate transparency. The background to the finance director's story was that the firm's success enabled it to attract top managers. In 1998, 2 executive directors were appointed with international experience. Problem was, one of these directors was the same relative who had previously put up the gladiatorial challenge. So what was going on? On the surface, what was going on was a well-publicized show leading to the firm's public listing. The public focus of the listing was the board's restructuring. Apart from the 2 new executive directors, a second major change was an establishment of various board committees following exchange guidelines. The firm's evolving organization was reflected in its board composition, and the firm won an award for good corporate governance. Beneath the surface, however, the new chair worked to use a publicly approved board structure on the rightmost side, the second from the right, pre-listing structure, to strengthen relationships among its extended community of family and non-family stakeholders. An opportunity appeared in the form of the same family director who had been brought back to the firm as an executive director. The latter had been put in charge of the firm's precast facility, which now showed a huge operating loss. The board wanted to sack the family director. The chair, however, advised the board to treat family director correctly. The hapless family director should be fired, but should remain a board director. The chair went on to suggest that precast losses might be financed by other profitable subsidiaries of the firm. Now, in terms of the persistence of this local construction firm, the incident suggested the negotiating power of its experienced chair. While his readiness to defy board consensus seemed worrying, the way that the chair understood and executed his role worked out well for his extended community. That will require the chair to continue relating with all stakeholders, including the family director. This meant a regular balancing act in which he drew on his educated knowledge of Chinese constructs. One such construct was renqing. What did I know about the practice of renqing? The chair inquired. In his practice, renqing was about enabling stakeholders to accept socially altruistic measures for the welfare of the extended firm, such as the funding of precast losses by profitable subsidiaries. With his cultural knowledge, the chair was able to pull off his balancing act, which effectively ended the family director's influence. As everyone knew, he had cocked up, while the chair's actions in protecting a major rival killed off all opposition, including opposition from the family director. Whereas the jazz player had relied on long-serving managers, the adopted chair drew on local knowledge in relating with internal resource networks. To some extent, the persistence of both firms were consequent upon particular features of their industries. But equally, my message in this lecture has been this: as locally acquired skills are required to operate in any environment, a close engagement with the nature of long-lived firms operating locally is equally unavoidable. In Southeast Asia, there are examples of such long-lived firms in their extended nature while remaining closely controlled. I have argued that the fact of large multi-generational firms that are controlled by ethnic Chinese clans, and that many of these conglomerates continue to grow under westernized sons of founders, require explanation. An explanation I've set out is that these firms may be controlled by blood relations, but their effectiveness depends on interactive relationships among internal networks that key networkers need to sustain regularly and imaginatively. In this scenario, the rebelliousness of the jazz player was at odds with the street smartness of the construction chair. And whereas the jazz player needed loyal colleagues to run his firm, the construction chair called on his own local skills to secure his future. It might be nice to have a leader of a Chinese firm who is both rebellious and loyal, but intuitively, the obvious clash in terms suggests that one or other characteristic needs to give. Local practices of the clan-based Chinese family will jar against a distant education that ignores the dynamics of learning beyond a fixed curriculum. I therefore preliminarily conclude that the persistence of multi-generational Chinese firms may be closely related with network skills and behavioral traits that are rooted in a changing local environment. So think locally and act globally, to invert the cliche. A related message is about the continuing influence of a particularist approach to education. That influence continues to emotionally constrain and enable the lives of Anglo-somethings who are neither Anglo nor anything else. Many Brexit voters might be pleasantly surprised by my suggestion that a distinctive Englishness about our education persists, in the same way that my generation were taught that only an English curriculum was good for them. The trouble is that some of those kids who imbibed this thinking have then been encumbered by a lifelong sense of an absent self-identity. Thank you very much.
Wilson, thank you very much indeed. I think we've got to the title. We had three very, I think, dramatic and compelling stories. Very pleasant stories, and I was fascinated by the way Wilson took three very close personal stories, and we had a personal journey and an intellectual journey coming together, and the way he was clearly shaping and understanding and interpreting those stories and connecting them and relating them to much wider contexts of around education, imperialism and globalization, and the way also he connected with a number of big questions around entrepreneurship and the nature of business itself. So Wilson, thank you for that really extraordinarily interesting lecture. Now, those of you who come to these regularly will know that we don't take questions, but we do invite a distinguished colleague from another institution to respond on our behalf. And I'm delighted we've got Professor Christian de Kock from the University of Essex.
Thank you. I'm very aware that I stand between you and the drink, so I'll definitely give to my 5 minutes. And mirroring Wilson's talk, I'll also bring out three stories, but as I say, they're much compressed time frame. Now the first one, and sort of, because I was thinking a little bit what I was going to say when Wilson kindly invited me, and I readily agreed. And my opening line is going to be, maybe not, but I'll stick to it, is I discovered Wilson. And then I thought, slightly too bombastic perhaps, so that may need some qualification. And that brings us to our first story. I actually met Wilson when I was teaching on the distance learning program in Singapore when I worked at Holloway. And I was his dissertation supervisor. And the material was quite extraordinary. It was documenting a takeover battle which had been sort of played out in all the newspapers, and pseudonyms we used were
Anthony Cleopatra.
Yes. So maybe you can reveal at the end of my talk after 20 years which
Oh, this is public knowledge. It's published, so there's nothing secret about it.
But I thought this is really interesting stuff, and I said, well, Wilson, and I think we were talking at the time, maybe you pursuing a PhD, and I said, well, would you be interesting maybe working on this material for a very good journal article which will help you, etc. and so on. I think we were discussing this at the cricket club of Singapore of all places. That's where an investment bank takes and eventually that paper made it into the Journal of Management Studies, and for the academics here, the business school academics, it's a 4-star in ref parlance, so very good. And that was sort of the start of a quite long-lasting sort of academic friendship, professional friendship, and Wilson helped me along the way quite a bit. That was the first little story. Second little story, which built on that. Wilson then went on to Cambridge, as the Vice Chancellor already indicated, upgraded supervisors to John Roberts. He's a great academic, so a very good choice. But he still always considered me a little bit of his mentor. And I do remember getting a phone call at sort of 1 in the morning when I came back from the restaurant, where you utter despair, saying it was going to end it all, and sort of, okay, made the utter despair moment quite quickly, so that's good. So if there's any of Wilson's PhD students here, don't hold back on dumping the emotional track on
Lots of PhD students.
So that's story 2. And story 3 is forward quite a bit in time. A few years ago I was doing a project on private equity, and Wilson very, very kindly basically opened his Rolodex, I think it was still Rolodex time at those days, to me, and of all places setting up a series of interviews in Belgium, which is my home country, which was sort of quite bizarre, because it's another part of Wilson's, I think you already alluded how he straddles, and it's quite unusual to straddle this world of practice, and we talk about it a lot, but there's actually very few people who genuinely straddle that sort of academic practitioner, almost the divide still. And you don't even mention your work with GIMP and then Belgium, private equity sector and so on. But yes, so he set up these interviews with me. We weren't even collaborating. He very generously sort of provided all these contacts to me. And it's sort of quite amusing that I have to learn about Belgian politics, both at the corporate and sort of the party political level from Wilson. So we'll probably catch up on some of those stories overnight. That's really sort of my 3 sort of very, very short anecdotes, which I hope sort of frame that sort of interesting dual dimension to Wilson's career. So that's it. I won't keep you so full of drinks. As promised, I will keep it short. So, well, Wilson, well done again. I'm very glad you are sort of professor in this institution. So thank you.
Thank you very much.